As an investigator, every case I worked on was important to me. This was one of the most challenging.
When a badly beaten woman was found on a dirt road near a major interstate, detectives could only hope she would live to tell her story.
When a person is a victim of a traumatic head injury, there's no telling how much they're going to remember about the crime. And in this case, we didn't know if the victim was going to survive.
With the victim on the brink of death, would investigators be able to find the person who left her for dead? Tallahassee, Florida, known for its southern charm and some of the state's most beautiful sights. But one November day, a couple driving on the outskirts of town spotted a severely beaten woman lying on the side of a dirt road. Horrified, they raced to get help. Deputy Bill Stafford of the Leon County Sheriff's Office was the first to respond to the scene.
At approximately 1:30, I was dispatched to a wooded area on Gearhart Road. This was in reference to a woman that was seen seriously injured, and upon arrival, I found the woman attempting to make her way out of these woods.
As Stafford approached the woman, he noticed she was about to go into shock. It was clear she had been sexually assaulted and severely beaten.
I could see at that point that she was very seriously injured, had a lot of serious head injuries. I wrapped her in a blanket and went to the radio to call for an ambulance. At that point, I wasn't real sure that she was going to make it until the ambulance got there.
Finally, the paramedics arrived and the woman was rushed to hospital. Deputy Stafford stayed behind and combed the area looking for clues that might explain what happened.
I located the area that supposedly was where the crime occurred and found a large piece of concrete on the ground where the victim was lying when the suspect threw the concrete down on her head.
Nearby, more crucial evidence was found. A pair of green overalls and a purse, identifying the woman as 20-year-old Sandy Richards from New Zealand. But how did Richards end up here on the side of the road? Canvassing the neighborhood, Stafford found some witnesses who'd noticed a suspicious car in the area.
I gathered some information from the witnesses. There was a car that was parked down the road from the crime scene with some other individuals, and they also got a tag number.
Police immediately put out a bulletin to be on the lookout for the car. They scoured the city for a sign of the vehicle, but found nothing. As Sandy Richards hovered on the brink of death, detectives learned more about the young woman from a phone number found in her purse. Captain Jack Poitinger of the Leon County Sheriff's Office oversaw the case.
The young lady in this case was 20 years old at the time. She left New Zealand, came to the United States. She was hoping to obtain a job as a nanny and to obtain employment in Panama City, Florida.
But how did she end up on a dirt road over 100 miles away from Panama City? Investigators waited to see if she would recover to answer the question.
She had a total of 5 major surgeries while she was here. Everybody's concern was that she'd survive. Obviously, she was the best source of information for the investigators as to what ultimately happened to her. Number 11.
While the victim remained in critical care, the case came to a standstill until Captain Poitinger called on investigator Dale Hinman for help.
When I was dispatched to the hospital, I was told the victim was probably not going to make it. When I saw her and saw the extent of her injuries, I was surprised she was alive.
Hinman felt certain that this was a failed homicide attempt.
Based on what we knew from the crime scene and the information we had so far, we all believed the attacker had left this victim for dead.
As Sandy Richards struggled for her life, investigators sent a crucial piece of evidence to the lab for analysis: the green overalls found at the crime scene. Tallahassee's crime lab analyst Karen Martin meticulously searched for evidence from the assault.
After examining the item visually, I use an alternate light source to try and find stains that fluoresce, which would be a possible indication for the presence of semen.
Under the blue light, Martin spotted what she thought could be traces of evidence.
I then take samples for both a presumptive test and a confirmatory test. The presumptive test is where I add a couple of chemicals, and if the color change is produced, then that's indications for the presence of semen.
The lab was able to confirm the presence of DNA evidence, but there was still no suspect to provide a match. Then, the break investigators had been hoping for. Sandy Richards was showing the unmistakable signs of recovery.
Once Sandy was able to talk, we hoped she would remember some detail that would help us to find the man who did this to her.
Remembering the details of a traumatic event can be difficult, even impossible. Agent Hinman consulted with forensic psychologist Dr. Patrick Cook to develop a strategy to unlock Sandy's memory.
Well, as you know, when somebody's been through a life-threatening trauma like that, it may or may not affect their memory. Some people have a very acute, very sharp memory of what happened to them. Some people don't want to remember it or don't want to believe it happened to them. And some people even may develop some false memories to fill in the gaps of what they don't remember. So I think it's real important that when you talk with her, she not feel pressure from you to come up with a memory.
So just to ask very open-ended questions and let her remember what she can about conversations and descriptions and items in the vehicle and things that he might have said and the direction of their travel.
Agent Hinman knew that initially, Richards would feel lost and disorientated.
I can't imagine what that would be like to be so far away from your family and so far away from any of your friends or anything that's familiar to you and be in a hospital all by yourself.
Well, as you know, in a post-traumatic stress syndrome, it's very, very important to have some kind of support system. That could work in your favor because if she trusts you, then you may be able to elicit some of those memories that are just kind of below the surface.
With a solid strategy in hand, Agent Hinman resumed her vigil by Sandy's bedside. Finally, it started to work. Bit by bit, Sandy's memories of what happened that day began to surface.
Sandy decided that the next stop in her trip across the U.S. would be New Orleans. She could renew her visa there and stay at a youth hostel. Hitchhiking is a very common way to travel in New Zealand, so she didn't think anything of it.
Sandy recalled getting into a car with a black male who said his name was James. It wasn't long before she realized something was wrong.
He signaled a turn and started to pull off, and Sandy asked him where he was going, and he said he had a package in the trunk of his car that he wanted to drop off at a friend's, and it would be a very quick stop. Well, she thought better of this and asked him to stop the car, and she would stay closer to the highway and get a ride with someone else.
James refused to stop and turned onto a dirt road.
Sandy realized very quickly what his intentions were. She tried to open the door, but it was locked. He struck her several times and then sexually assaulted her. The last thing that she remembered was being strangled with the straps of her bib overalls.
At that point, she blacked out. Then she remembered waking up and crawling towards the main road. Agent Hinman was grateful to know the broad outlines of the crime, but there was still not enough detail to pinpoint a suspect. For that, she would need to return to the crime scene, accompanied by Captain Poettinger. By visiting the area, Hinman hoped to understand why Sandy's attacker chose this particular spot to make his move.
Dale, this is the area where the victim was found. It's been pretty deserted, pretty remote. There's not a great deal of residents down here.
The investigators began to connect what they saw with what the victim told them.
He drove all the way to the end to determine if there were in fact houses here or if the road continued on. But once he realized how secluded this area was, he pulled into this road to attack the victim. Well, it sounds more like to me that he's really not familiar with this area and he's not from here.
Agent Hinman believed the attacker was a transient passing through town. If he had been from the area, he would have driven to a familiar place without seeming lost. Unfortunately, the driver could have been anyone.
This is the area where the victim was found back here, and you can see it's kind of a small depressed area. What we learned from the crime scene tech who came and worked the scene is that they found a large piece of concrete block. Appears that he used that to strike her head with.
Well, it looks like the individual is using only items that are readily available at the crime scene, like the straps of the victim's garment and the cement blocks from the scene. So it looks as though he hasn't come to the scene prepared to commit the attack, but that he got this idea as they were traveling along and then used items that were available at this scene, which probably suggests that he's not a very experienced killer, that he doesn't bring his own preferred method.
Well, that really is consistent with the fact that, here you have a girl from New Zealand who's hitchhiking. She's hitchhiking from Panama City. He brings her to Tallahassee, to this desolate area, believing that if he does kill her, that nobody's going to be able to find her body. If they do, they won't be able to identify her. She's kind of a disposable victim.
Absolutely.
But not as disposable as her attacker thought. Sandy Richards was about to remember a critical detail. As Sandy Richards recovered from the attempt on her life, she remembered a vital detail investigators had desperately been hoping for.
Sandy had only been in the country for a short period of time, so she was not that familiar with American cars. She remembered that the car was white and had burgundy interior, and that Oldsmobile was written on the car.
Using a book that described every Oldsmobile ever made, Hinman tried to tap into Sandy's memory for more specific details. And it worked. Coming across a photo of a specific model, Sandy excitedly identified it as the assailant's car.
Sandy was able to pick out a two-door Oldsmobile Toronado, and she said it had a digital clock and a compass on the dashboard.
Instantly flooded with memories, she was able to recall another precious detail.
Sandy indicated that the person who attacked her had something to do with aerosol manufacturing. Said he worked at a plant in Miami manufacturing aerosol or aerosol containers.
Investigators began a statewide manhunt.
We did an extensive search in the state of Florida for late model two-door white Oldsmobiles that might have been registered to the black male, that might also be employed at an aerosol manufacturing plant. We visited a number of plants, talked to a number of employees and supervisors, but we were not able to locate anybody that matched our particular description.
Without a suspect, the case went cold. Sandy Richards returned home to New Zealand, knowing that her attacker was still on the loose. And for years, the unsolved case continued to haunt Agent Hinman. It was the one case she could never seem to forget.
Because I had spent so much time with Sandy during the course of this investigation, perhaps this case became a little more personal to me. We became friends. I often thought of her over the years. I wondered how she was, and I wondered what I could do to solve this case.
As her experience in dealing with the criminal mind deepened, Agent Hinman decided to revisit the Sandy Richards case. She had a theory, and she wanted to discuss it with forensic psychologist Dr. Patrick Cook.
What I've been thinking is, based on all the other cases that I've seen over the years, that these sexually related or sexually natured type of crimes are committed by someone who will repeat this type of crime over and over again.
I agree with you. I think with the combination of the sexual violence and the physical violence, it's entirely possible that he's committed some other crimes.
If Sandy's attacker had reoffended since then, he might have been arrested. And if so, there may finally be a way to identify him.
Since this crime has occurred, there's been so many developments in the DNA arena, and if we resubmit the evidence in this case, there's a possibility we may match some other crime from somewhere else in the state or in the country.
Carefully preserved evidence in the sheriff's vault could provide the key. The DNA on Sandy Richards' overalls was reanalyzed at the Tallahassee Crime Lab. David Kaufman compared the genetic profile to the Florida database for convicted offenders.
In the late 90s, a new procedure was developed. It's called STR, which stands for Short Tandem Repeat. It's very discriminating. You can get results on much smaller samples. It works much better on degraded samples, and it's also much quicker to get a result. Well, when the case was resubmitted for analysis, a DNA profile was developed. That profile was put into the forensic index here within the state of Florida, and then I conducted a search against the convicted offender index.
When DNA from the Sandy Richards case was run through the Florida offender database, years after the case had gone cold, they finally struck lucky.
Once we conducted the search, we found that one individual out of our entire database matched this particular case, and that individual's name was Willie Oliver.
Willie Oliver was now 55 years old and living just outside of Tampa. Just as Hinman had predicted, his DNA was entered into the convict database several years ago when he committed another crime.
When investigators looked into Willie Oliver's background, they discovered he had a criminal record. He had been arrested for aggravated battery, served time in prison, and he had been released.
Investigators weren't surprised to learn that Oliver had never worked with aerosol products as he had claimed. They now suspected it was simply a ploy to buy time while planning his next move with the victim.
Based on the DNA database hit, a warrant was obtained for Willie Oliver's arrest. At the time of the arrest, he claimed he had never even been to the Tallahassee area, but none of us really expected him to confess.
Although Willie Oliver denied any involvement in the crime, he was arrested and brought to Tallahassee for trial, where he would face the irrefutable DNA evidence. And that was not the only thing he would face. The prosecutor was someone who had been with the case from the start. Captain Jack Poitinger was now a state attorney, and he wouldn't dream of letting anyone else prosecute this case.
In the course of the struggle, our overalls get torn.
One by one, investigators took the stand, including Agent Hinman, who had waited years for this moment.
Did she provide you that description?
Yes, she did.
Do you recall when that interview would have taken place?
In between her being treated by the doctor, she went to x-ray, different people were hustling around the room, and as time would allow, I would sit with the victim and ask her questions about the description so that this information could be given to the uniformed officers right away so they could look for an offender.
Sandy Richards had made the trip back to the United States to testify. Shy of the cameras, she bravely recounted the aftermath of her attack.
Well, apart from the scarring on my face, I have limited vision in my left eye. I can see, but it's not a brilliant sight. I don't have my front teeth.
In the end, dedicated police work and DNA evidence couldn't be overcome. Willie Oliver was found guilty of the sexual assault and attempted murder of Sandy Richards.
Well, to me, this is a prime example that justice delayed is not always justice denied.
Oliver was sentenced to life in prison. The case that no one could forget was finally closed.
Willie Oliver probably thought he had committed the perfect crime. He sexually assaulted his victim and left her for dead. But technology finally caught up with him and helped to bring Sandy the justice that was long overdue.